Hello everybody and welcome to the Avid Reader Bookshop. My name is Chrissy Dean and I'm being very COVID safe with microphone at the moment as our borders open. A couple of things before we start the event tonight. I'd like to welcome all the people who are joining us via Zoom at the moment. So welcome to the Zoom people. There are quite a lot of people that have joined us on Zoom as well. So just for the people in the room, we have about double this size audience tonight, which is very exciting. Another little bit of information is that after this event tonight, I've just run into David, who's an accordion player of note in the Italian community, and he and his band Zumpa are playing across the road at the Bearded Lady. So he wanted to let you guys know, as he heard the Italian music playing inside, that if anyone wants to party on, the Bearded Lady across the road has Zumpa playing Italian music. He was actually, goodness, he might have heard himself. Why are you playing my music? But anyway, yeah, he's in there and he's about to play. So afterwards, they're playing till 9 o'clock, so you'll have plenty of time to have a drink and listen after this too, which is great. Okay, so welcome everybody. Please feel free to come through and grab a seat. We're just beginning to kick off. So I'd like to start this evening by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. In this area, it's the Yagara and the Turrbal people. And I'd like to pay my deepest respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any elders who are here tonight. And also because we're coming to you via Zoom, I'd like to acknowledge that we're zooming out onto the lands of many different Aboriginal peoples. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. So for the people in the room tonight, there's a couple of bits of housekeeping. One of them is that if you do need to, just out there in the very corner over there, there is an outdoor toilet that you can use at any time. So feel free to use that when you need to. Also, for the people in the room, there is a bar which will be open at the end of the event as well. And if you did miss the book, it's front and centre at the counter. So after the event, we're going to have a signing which will be inside. For the people on Zoom, you can actually call us during this event on 3846 3422 and pay for a book and get it personally autographed. Or else we'll have some autographed copies afterwards. And you can order online. There is a link to the book online that we'll be sending out to you, and that link's coming to you in the chat function, and that chat function is exactly where you can ask questions at the end of the event. So if you have any questions during the event, just type them into the chat bar, and then they will get magically texted to me out here, and I will be able to ask your question at the end of the event, which is excellent. So for the people in the room, if you have your phones with you, if you can turn that to silent, that'd be great. Then we won't get interrupting phones in the middle of the event. I think that may be all I need to tell you before we start proceedings. We still have a few more people heading through. So as they head through, I will remind people that the bar will be open for another drink at the end of the event. And that there is still some food platters as well to work our way through as we are waiting for the big signing queue that will inundate Jacqueline at the end of this event. So I'd like to introduce Jacqueline Bawtree to you, who works as a writer and photographer, exploring the stories of her hometown and surrounds through her work as the urban gypsy. Welcome to Jacqueline. And in conversation with Jacqueline tonight, we have Diana Cantarucci, who is the consigliere on com.it.es, the Committee of Italians Abroad for Queensland and Northern Territory, as well as marketing coordinator for the Italian Business Women's Network. She also works at Screen Queensland when we have intersected. So please welcome Liana.
Christine. Oh my goodness, this is a full room tonight. So welcome to everyone who is joining us over Zoom. So before I begin, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional elders, owners of the land upon which we gather here tonight. Pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be joining us here tonight. And particularly as a first generation Australian, I would like to acknowledge the 60,000 years of generations of First Nations peoples who have been here long before we have, and express that this always was and always will be West the centres that are Aboriginal land. And so let's dive straight into it. But I would love to tell you all how Jackie and I met. So we met in 2018 through a multi-art project, which was done in collaboration with QPAC and the Museum of Brisbane. It was called Impossible Conversations, and it was a multi-art project. Jacqueline was the photographer, and engaged another 6 members of the extended Italian community. And essentially, we had spoken at the time about how Jackie had lived in Italy, had studied the language, which made her absolutely perfect for the project. She had such this intimate knowledge and passion for our culture, our language, and our community. But I did not know until Jackie gave me this book, 2 weeks ago, that she had this utterly fascinating, wonderful insight, personal, spiritual, emotional, and about embracing new life and new language. So with that rather haphazard introduction, I'm going to ask Jackie the very first question. It's a quite simple one, Jackie, just to start us off a little bit gently. Now, Jackie, you've been to the UK for a couple of months, was it, to visit family, but you actually hadn't stepped foot in Europe before as such. But you're always interested in travel. And you had mentioned that you had wanted to travel to France, to Spain, Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt. But the question really is, in the end, why Italy? What is it about Italy?
It's a long journey. So despite popular perception, I'm not actually Italian. My parents are English. I feel I need to clarify that.
Definitely looking very Italian,
Yeah.
The Sicilian lemons. Yeah.
Yeah, I decided to dress like a bottle of limoncello tonight. May have one later. But my fascination with Italy is long. Like we were chatting the other night, I thought, oh, I work out how to pinpoint, and it started quite a long time ago. It's like, when did your romance start with someone? It's like, oh, go back to the beginning. And there's lots of different touch points, but when I moved to Sydney in about 20 years ago now, I'm trying to think what year it was. And my first job was at the Marriott Hotel, and the team I was in, a lot of the girls I worked with were Macedonian, Greek, Maltese, and Italian. And so I just loved hanging around with them. They're just a really joyful group, and got a taste of the culture through them, very much so. So that was probably the first touch point. And during that time, one of the girls we were working with, who wasn't actually Italian, had done night classes in Italian. I remember thinking, oh, that's quite a cool thing to do. Maybe I'll do that one day when I get time. And then it was a couple of years later that I moved to Melbourne and spent a year living in Melbourne, which is obviously strong Italian romanticism. Yeah, so the culture and the way that impacts life down there, and the cafe culture I really loved. And then I ended up coming back to Sydney, and I worked in football, so the World Game, sorry. And that is, I came in at a time where now it's known as the A-League, but the Soccer League had been completely reshaped, I guess, from a time when the soccer clubs were very like they were connected to different cultures. So Brisbane Roar came out of the Dutch community. Others were Italian, or the Croat, or Serbian. And so this was this new league that I was a part of, but clearly both on and off the field, there was a lot of different cultures, a lot of Italians still around, so there's different cultures. And yeah, so there's lots of different connection points. Sorry, it's a long story. So I sort of built this relationship, but then there was also a love of art. So I actually fell in love probably with France on the art front first. So back in the late 90s, there was an amazing exhibition at the Queensland Art Gallery in Paris. It came, I think, from the Musée d'Orsay. It was a bit like the one we just had here at the European Masters, where it was quite a landmark thing. I was only about 22 at the time. And that was my introduction, like to people, to the Monets and the Renoirs and all those classic impressionists that we fall in love with first. So my love of art had grown, and then when I finally decided I wanted to go overseas or study a language, like Italian, I don't know why. I guess the girl who studied it was like, that sounds fun, I'm going to do that. But it combined love of art potentially influencing places to go. So that was my step point. Just a tiny bit more. I do love France as well. It leads the whole August, really.
As a member of the Italian community, I definitely agree with that word. That's a great word for orchids. So with that, so you knew that Italy was the target. And I guess we all love to escape through the pages, and I hope you all do escape through the pages of Jackie's. Oh, thank you. Escape through the pages of Jackie's book. Thank you, Chrissy. In order to escape to a beautiful foreign land, and that's I think why we love travel memoirs, because we can really escape through the words, the descriptions of what you see, what you eat, what you do. Eat. But in the end, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that you were age 35 in this very established point in your career, this fantastic organisation, the Football Federation of Australia. People would kill to have this sort of job. And you were willing to, let's use that phrase, throw caution to the wind a little bit. We could talk about whether or not you feel that phrase is accurate, and go to Italy for an indefinite amount of time. And doesn't that sound terrifying to most people? I don't know about you. I grew up in an Italian household, and that sounds terrifying to me, an indefinite amount of time. So do you have any fears, Jackie, about how this would affect your long-term financial security, your career path?
At the time, so I started working in football. It coincided with the end of my marriage as well. So it was a fairly heady time, but I came into football on the back of our first qualification for the World Cup in 32 years. So I think in 2006. I started at a pretty amazing time and a point in the sport, and it was a very heady time. And so as my relationship crumbled, I just threw myself into work, as you tend to do. It was a pretty cool place to throw myself into work, and very good place to escape. So I guess I'd got to a point, I had an amazing network. I was working for the national organisation, so not just a club, not that that's not great, but immense network. I was working with all the clubs, A-League clubs around Australia. I was working with the big sponsors, had quite a big network. So I just hit a point, we were about to start bidding for the World Cup at the time and the Asian Cup. Things were shifting within the organisation. I thought, if I'm going to take a break, this is now. And I wasn't sure if it would be 6 months or a year, but my boss actually said, why don't you just resign for 3 months, or we'll hold the job open for 3 months. And I was like, I need to just let go and, just
That's quite an offer.
Yeah.
From one's employer.
Yeah.
Really.
And I did think about it, but I knew I just needed to at that point, I needed to let go and for a caution to win. I just needed to explore from a personal perspective. My relationship had been quite all-consuming and supporting my husband, and then I'd thrown myself into a job that was all-consuming, and so I guess I wanted to find an identity outside of the marriage and the job, and to do that I probably just needed to cut all the strings for a little bit. It was a bit crazy, but anyway, don't think so now. But at the time I felt confident that I could go away for that time, and I would probably come back and safely be able to find work. Whether it was back in football, I wasn't sure if that was what I wanted, even though I was loving it. But I was, just trying to open the door to new possibilities and see where the road led.
Well, you just mentioned then that your particular line of work was working with sponsors at the Football Federation of Australia, and that your role really, because you were facilitating events for we're talking high-profile sponsors with high-profile football players, and we mean soccer, by the way, just to clarify. Essentially, your actual job role, was to facilitate things for others, other people's careers, their sort of business networking, sponsorship success, and also in your personal life to briefly touch upon your relationship. Your ex-partner was an actor, so pursued quite a, let's say, without being disparaging, a relatively precarious career path, where you were positioned to be the one to be the primary breadwinner to facilitate that within your personal life. So if we can touch on that just a tad to give a little bit of tad more context, did that really influence your idea of going to Italy and putting yourself in the starring role of your life?
To some degree, I think I was married quite young. So I was 22 when I got married, which was my niece who was got married at 22. Love you guys. But at that time, I had not really worked out what I wanted to do. I had some ideas. I thought I might like to study journalism. I've been overseas to see family. So I mentioned earlier, I've been to England. I spent 2 months visiting family. My parents are English. And when we got married, married someone with a big vision and big dreams, and I saw huge potential. So I was like, well, that's my role in life, is to support that and see him succeed. We tend to do a lot. And when that didn't work out, through that into working in football, which was supporting other people, and I loved it. My first 10 years of work was in admin roles and support roles, and I love that work. I love being part of that. But it did get to a point, once you get early 30s, it's like, I kind of want to do something a bit more. I'm around, and I was around very successful people, or people who really knew what they wanted to do, or gone into uni really with a focus. So even between the husband who knew what he wanted to do, working with footballers who are obviously living their dream, but even in the behind the scenes, and hello to my own family on Zoom who are down in Sydney, but I have friends who had studied like leisure management or done communications at uni, and they were on a career path that made sense to them, and for me I was a little bit like, I'm not quite sure where I fit at this point in my life. So it was, maybe not putting myself as the star, dying being in front of an audience right now. I used to be behind the scenes at events and behind the camera. But the central protagonist of my story, it's like, what does that mean for me? Like, before I move on to another relationship or another job, what is important to me, and what do I want to focus on going forward? That will make my life fulfilling.
And I think your story, of course, being a travel memoir, does a lot of people may think that, and you mentioned this earlier in your book, that there's little things that may remind people of other quite high-profile travel memoirs, such as When in Rome. You mentioned See Maples Die. You mentioned Under the Tuscan Sun, and another example is Eat, Pray, Love. And I think it's good to sort of point out or ask what you think is the difference between the catalyst that caused the author Elizabeth Gilbert to embark on her journey. What was the difference you feel mainly between hers and what brought you to Italy?
I don't know how many people here. I'm just looking at the demographic. Ready, Pray, Love, ladies. And it is, well, it's actually quite an old book now, so 10 years old, I think. Crazy. At the time of planning my trip, Eat, Pray, Love was very popular, which I didn't realise. I used to see it on the bookshelf, so I was very big into travel memoirs. It's all about travel memoirs. What am I going to go? What am I going to do? And I kept picking up Eat, Pray, Love and reading about this woman who left her marriage and then suddenly was off travelling in Italy and India and Bali to find herself. But I didn't relate to her because she had left her marriage, whereas my marriage had ended without my buy-in to the decision. So it was quite different. Like, I just didn't like it, basically. Like, tried, but didn't like it. It's like, you tried, Jacqueline. Let's say I picked up this book club and everyone's reading it, and every time I talked about wanting to do this trip, I was like, it's like Eat, Pray, Love. And I'm like, no, it's not. So I ended up reading it, and I did enjoy it for what it was. And well done to Elizabeth and her journey. Getting paid to write the book. I didn't get paid to write my book, just fine.
She had an advance to write that. Yeah. That's
So very different. Very different. Whereas for me, the books that influenced me was an Australian writer called Penelope Green, who's a journalist. And When in Rome was her first one, where she went to Perugia and then she was working like as a waitress in Rome. So she was actually a journalist back here in Australia and did the whole career break, and I'm just going to learn the language. And then she ended up in Naples, which is what sparked my love of Naples, which is the dark jewel of Italy's south. And the way she wrote about place and exploring people, I just loved, because she explored organised crime and religion and the feelings in the streets. And she was just adventurous as well. Like, she wasn't just there for a bit of fluff and nonsense. She was really cool. So she was, yeah, probably more influential. And then I just thought about this today. This wasn't a book at some point. Many edits and things have come out, but one of my slightly different to travel memoirs, but one of my big influences in deciding where I would study Italian when I was making the decision was actually a James Bond film, just in light of the fact the latest film's out, but Quantum of Solace, James Craig. Like emerges out into the middle of Siena in the middle of the Palio horse race, and I'd been to Siena the year before on a trip and I had quite liked it. I'd been there for the day. I was like, this is beautiful, and it was actually probably where the sea was later to come back. So I was like, I went to the film. I'm like, that's it, Siena, done. James Bond, thanks.
Perfect inspiration. And you mentioned Siena because you did then go on and study the period in Siena. Which, by the way, is where they claimed that the best Italian was spoken. So if anyone wanting to learn the language, you hear perfect, beautiful Italian in the streets of Siena. A bit different from Napoli in Naples, where you did eventually move on to. They speak a very strong dialect, very strong accent. But what I'd love to actually do is read out a little section here that I found particularly insightful and inspiring. Because you kicked off your trip with a 2-week art and history tour in Rome. And on page 29 of my dog-eared, well-loved book, I just want to read this section. Astounded by the ruins of the Colosseum and the Roman Forum on our first night, I blinked back the tears as I tried to quash the reminder that my husband wasn't there with me. I knew he also would have loved the view into the ancient world from where I stood, looking out over the ruins from behind Piazza Venezia. Sadness that our plans to explore Europe together one day had never been realised. It crept in briefly, as instead I found myself standing with a group of strangers I'd only met a few hours earlier. I shoved the broken dream away, determined not to have anything taken away from me in that moment as my eyes absorbed the remaining architectural wonders of a world long lost. So why I love that section is the main question is you've been through quite a period with this transition of deciding to leave a career, about your relationship status changing. And that's quite a transition. And here you are in arguably one of the most beautiful places on earth. And against all your past dreams, intentions, visions, you were doing it da sola, alone. So how do you navigate that space between the empowerment of being there, the wonder of what you're seeing, but also heartache, some bitterness, some disappointment?
I think at that point, it was about 2 years after my marriage had ended, and it took an enormous amount of saving for a start to do a trip. So I did a 3-week trip initially, a week in Paris and this 2-week art history tour initially. I wrote a lot very empowering for me. So I love you guys. So I travelled quite a bit for work, and I learned to be tough with the clubs, dealing with the commercial managers and the football clubs. I worked in fairly good roles, but I don't want to say girly roles, but low key. I wasn't the one, pushing to make things happen. Whereas suddenly I was dealing with commercial managers going, "I need you to do this for me." And there was a range of things that really strengthened my ability to just get out and do things that were more adventurous than I perhaps would have done 2 or 3 years earlier on my own. And that moment was quite big because we had always talked about, we got married quite young, but it was like, we'll travel one day together. And we had managed to go to Borneo just on a 10-day holiday because we just could never, once, as life continues, it's very hard to find a month to go to Europe or 6 weeks to make it worth your while. So we'd end up going to Borneo, to Saba, and that was amazing, but we never made it to Europe. And my ex actually really loved, we didn't talk probably more about ancient history, I guess. So I knew that he would have loved that very much. So those moments always come up, and I remember it was actually probably a week later, I think I mentioned in the book again, that we glided into Venice on a gondola, and I was again with this group of, well, they weren't so strange by then, I think I'd known them a week by then, but new friends. And there was probably less of a moment then, but it was actually 2 years since he had come back and said he was leaving, so I was really conscious of the date, but I'm like, you know what, here I am gliding to Venice. And then I was so overwhelmed by being in Venice, like I think I just walked around the streets going, I'm in Venice. Oh my gosh, I'm in Venice. This is how, oh my gosh, I'm in a Disney film. So there was a lot of like it varied between those emotions of like, oh my gosh, my life kind of crumbled 2 years ago. Oh, well, check me out.
Look where I am now.
Where I am. How do you do it?
Yeah.
So it gave you this burst of confidence.
Yeah, definitely. And I wanted to travel so much, it was a real, just, it's amazing when you
It overrides everything.
Yeah, when you've managed to do something, I don't know, like writing a book, but you've been to do it for a while. Yeah, it's very empowering anyway, just to know that you've actually managed to achieve it and get to that place.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, that's a really good segue to my next question, which is about the language learning journey. So anyone in this room who's ever learned a language knows it's a journey, it's a lifelong journey. Yes, I guess some groans, like yes. So you had to start it off in Sydney with some beginner classes. And then you find yourself completely immersed, which they say is the best way to learn language. But it's not a magic pill, is it? You don't think that, oh, I'm going to just soak it up like a sponge. I'm going to be fluent in a month. It doesn't really happen like that. And you're very descriptive. Yeah. And you're very descriptive in the book about this journey, because language learning gives you the highs and the lows. And yeah, take us through that. Take us through, well, if you can actually start off with how you felt when you were doing those beginner lessons in Sydney.
So I started these beginner lessons in the way, probably about a year after and magnificent teacher called Giacomo, who was brilliant, and so yeah, he was great. But I just remember, like, the classes straight away. I think Italian, because there's so many words from the Latin that are similar, so I was like, oh, I could actually learn this, like just add a vowel on the end, you're good to go. And
You're right in a lot of cases when you do that, though.
so, yeah. But I'd learned Japanese at school, unfortunately didn't keep going, and I did enjoy that. I remember enjoying it, but not really taking to it quite as well. And then started Italian, and they have a phrase in Italian, which I hope I get right, because my Italian's still terrible, but dolce in bocca, is that right? Sweet in the mouth, like Italian language tastes sweet in the mouth, and it really just tastes sweet in the mouth. It's such a beautiful language to learn, and if you hear someone speaking it, and maybe not Naples, so I love Naples as well, but the musical north, like I worked on a farm, we'll get to that, but I worked on a farm and the farmer was from outside Milan, I think, and his voice was so musical because the way the language reads is incredible. So I fell completely in love. And did this, I don't know, 8 or 10 week, a couple of hours a week in Sydney, and then finally decided to do this trip maybe a year or 18 months later. I thought, I've done beginners, I'm good. So I registered, like you could register for the beginners week or the week after, like if you thought you had enough. So I went the week after and walked into a class that was like, right. There's no English allowed in here. So I'm looking at the English speakers, became friends with a padre from Oklahoma, who was quite helpful. But it was like, I'm really stuck. So I really struggled the first week, and the teacher was just like, what were you thinking? I was like, I thought it's basic Italian, but apparently I don't. So it was a bit of a long haul. I had 6 weeks in Siena. I thought like that would be enough, and I did look at extending, but ended up deciding to go and work on a farm where they didn't speak a lot of English. And I thought, you know what, I had the basics. My grammar still is richissimo, but we're getting there, really, right? But yeah, ended up on a farm where I had a couple of English speakers. The first 2 weeks I was working on the farm, the next 2 weeks I was pretty much on my own, and it did help. I mean, I'm sure I did speak great Italian, but they were very patient, and as long as I was one on one, you sort of you keep trying. But then I ended up down in Naples. What I had been learning as well in the north was, a bit of Italian language.
Yeah, it really is. The gesticulating is very important.
Yeah. So, but I ended up in Naples having this accident, which disempowered my arm waving skills, and had very little verbal language to deal with a medical emergency. So I was lying in a hospital bed, unable to swear at anyone with my hands. And it was kind of layers, like Siena going, oh, I really don't speak the language, and then Elba feeling a bit more empowered, but also like this is tricky, like still trying to learn vegetable names so I can ask, can I have these vegetables to make my dinner tonight? And then in hospital going, I can't even ask someone to take me to the bathroom. I can't remember how to do that right now. So yeah, there was highs and lows, and there still are. I'm still trying to learn Italian. I'm not sure my Italian teacher was going to be here tonight. I haven't spotted her yet, but I'm sorry, Sarah, I'm still terrible.
Well, to sort of then segue into the accident, I want to just let everyone know the amazing text message that Jackie sent her family. Small drama, knocked down by a moped in Italy. Seriously, in hospital but okay. Broken shoulder, knees operation, driver handsome. It's very important. Yeah, it's a very important detail. So the question is, how long exactly were you in hospital? And I mean, you were already embarking on, but you were, I suppose we're all going through an emotional journey in one way, shape, or another. But you were going through essentially this emotional journey, this healing journey now. So can you tell us more about that? In addition to the struggles of doing that in a foreign language.
So I was in hospital 3 weeks in the end, had to have a major operation to repair said arm, which was completely smashed. The top of it was completely smashed because I was thrown through the air in Red Bull. Too much high drama. But yeah, so three weeks was quite a long time, and that was partly travel insurance. I couldn't fly with the injury. I had to with an operation as well. There had to be a certain amount of time until I could go on a plane. It's not healing, sorry.
The most important thing that we hope that you keep part of it.
So I remember someone telling me on my first trip, the tour guide, I guess, saying that Italian hospitals are known for the amount of noise in them because of all the families that come in, and just Italians are quite loud generally. So I remember coming in the ambulance, and I was left in emergency, and it was excruciating, and I was left like literally holding my arm, just going, I don't know what's actually happened. It just dislocated. I don't know. But it hurt a lot, and I just remember screaming. But I know I've got a couple of psychologists in the room tonight, and you can enlighten me further on this. But I remember a lot of emotional pain coming out. So at that point, I thought I was quite good with the marriage breakdown, but there was this odd sense of emotion that slipped through that was not just physical, but all that, I guess it's muscle memory or something that you store from your emotions when you've been through something like that. And it came out, and I just remember thinking, I've heard Italian hospitals are noisy. I'm going to do my bit for it.
Makes your contribution.
Good scream. My scream. Mainly because it was fun, to be honest. To kind of manage the pain, but yeah, so that was quite an interesting experience, and I didn't dwell a lot on it. I was very conscious of it, just saying, I think there's a lot of stuff coming out here that's unrelated to what's just happened to me. I couldn't quite process at the time. And then, yeah, the healing process was phenomenal in terms of the spiritual stuff.
Yeah, I think that would be a great place to sort of move into that, because I think this is after everything you've been through, and you just had these wonderful, insightful experiences, and you met these amazing people at the farm, and then something like this happens, and it's unfair. So how do you navigate that coming from also a spiritual point of view?
So I've had a strong faith throughout my life. I haven't always pursued it in terms of, if you're interested in something, you study it, right? You learn more about it. I grew up in a Christian family, and I learned a lot in that time, and had maintained my faith, but had dropped away from going to church. I think church is very complex in terms of it's changed in communities in recent years. particularly during my time in Italy, you know, more time to meditate, to pray, to reflect, to sit in big old churches and think about why you're there. So I've been doing quite a lot of that. But ended up in hospital, and clearly, I was lying on a road in cobblestones outside the Archaeological Museum in the centre of Naples, just going, it's very tricky because I go back and forth. But I, at the beginning of my trip, I always felt I would end up in Naples and there was some strong connection there. It's very hard to explain, but I always knew that. So I remember lying on the road and immediately going, God's got me. I think I'm in a bit of a pickle. God's got me. And then I knew I was so conscious when I was in hospital, and I have a praying family, but people around the world were praying for me, and I was travelling on my own. It's a really big deal to be in a hospital where you have no support. But I had family looking for contacts, and my aunt in England found someone in New Mexico who'd been involved in a church in Naples, a Protestant church, and so a week into my stay, I had a pastor turn up from a Baptist church that was involved with the military base and NATO base. And then I had the wives and other people turning up to look after me as well. But in the midst of all that were the Italian families who just embraced me. So there was one lady in particular who very sadly passed away last year, who's my Italian mum, Tina, who was actually like 3 days younger than my own mother. Looked quite like her, and her husband Sandro looks quite like my dad. And Tina was in hospital with me with her own injury, but she's just one of those nodders who was like, right, everyone mobilise. So she had everyone, including the other patients, the other families, the staff.
Italian women are good at doing that, by the way.
Yeah. and you knew she was that sort of person as well, because I had something like 9 different flatmates, I like to call them, in the hospital, namely honest, but some younger friends as well, and the way the families responded to that person. And she always had people around her and loving her and looking after her, and she was throwing it all right back out. So she was incredible. Another girl, Karina, who was actually Romanian and German, and I'm hoping she might have come in on Zoom tonight, so hi Karina over here. She was actually visiting another patient, came across me, spoke enough English and wanted to practice her English on me, and came every day to visit me and became a real angel. She ended up being in my operation because one of the doctors quite liked her and invited her to come and watch. That was my understanding of it. She got pretty shit away. So, which was amazing because she was able to come and say, this is what they did, and the surgeon is amazing, and he made sure no one was like leaning on your body, because they actually took bone out of my hip to put into my arm because it was so smashed. So Karina was amazing, Anastasia and Antonina, who were close to my sister's age, who just, it was like they handed the baton from person to person. And 18 months after I came back, I actually went back to Italy to spend time with all these people, because I'm like, who are they? Who are these people that took care of me? Like, amazing. But I was reading a book about Naples by an art historian, and I discovered a painting by Caravaggio, which is in the centre of Naples, called The Seven Works of Mercy, which is to, and I've got to remember it, feed the hungry, provide drinks, clothes. Oh no, I can't remember it. It's terrible. Parents, can you yell that? But anyway, the 7 works of mercy to take care. But basically, that was my experience in Naples, and I had this moment when I was in hospital where another patient was praying over me, and I didn't really know a lot about it, but she was praying over me. Norma, she was actually, I think, like Ecuadorian or Venezuelan, I can't remember, but living in Naples. And she was praying over me, and I remember that verse coming to me about, I was hungry, you gave me food, I was thirsty, you gave me drink. So I remember thinking, oh, this is, when she prayed, I thought of that verse. 18 months later, I read about this Caravaggio painting. If anyone doesn't know Caravaggio, he's an amazing, Baroque painter. But that painting actually, I found out, defines the spirit of Naples. So they embrace strangers and they make sure they're cared for. And it was like, oh my goodness, like I had this huge experience connected to this 500-year-old painting that still impacts how that city operates today and how they cared for me. And so there were so many things that happened. And there was another day when I was sitting there thinking, oh, but no one coming to see me today, because I literally had a stream of visitors, which shocked my other flatmates. So like, how do you know so many people? Like, I don't know, that's Jenny. It's thanks to former patients who come back and check on me, or their family will check on me. But I sat there and I just had like messages from Italy, from Australia, people were checking in on me that day. So it was just constant for 3 weeks that I was never alone. So I was very conscious of prayer and God being with me from the moment I was lying on that road. So yeah, strengthened my faith, and I guess when you said there's disappointment when something goes wrong, but I just felt like I will learn from this and I'll grow from this.
Yeah, you were given a window, weren't you?
Yeah.
Into, and what really comes across in the book, particularly in that section, is how you'd come back to life in a lot of ways, but you've also learned so much about the nature of love and all its forms. Can you tell us more about that?
I think when you go to Italy and you're divorced, you're like, hello. You can fall in love with them, have a magical life, and like Penelope Reed, who I had launched her books, ended up with a boy from Naples and living on the islands, project up, amazing project, I can't beach it, but it's beautiful in the Bay of Naples. So I was like, that will work for me, thanks very much. So, you know, quite like that was what I was in the market for, just quietly. I'd like to still say, you know, working out what I was doing with my life. I thought that might be it. And there were certainly moments along the way, but I guess the biggest lesson that I learned and continue to learn is that we put so much focus on romantic relationships, which of course your life partner is incredibly important, but all the relationships around you. And you know, Italy is a great place to learn about family. Certainly, we grew up here without extended family. So to see extended family in action was really amazing and really reminded me, you know, we're going through COVID at the moment, and it broke my heart last year knowing that people were in hospital without family able to visit them, because while I didn't have family able to visit me, I had my family that surrounded me, which was incredible. And they knew that. And I think too often we rely on the health system without going, right, we need to be there for the people we love. But yeah, generally relationships, you know, the Greeks have, what did we work out, seven different types of love that they talk about. But there's family relationships, your friend relationships, there's so many things that shape our lives and who we are. They will need a bit of an equal footing, I think, a little bit less focused on our romance. Not that that's not.
Well, what do we want? You've been through this whole journey and then you decide to write a book. How do you even begin to put down all your thoughts, feelings, people you met, things you ate, things you see onto the written word? How do you even start? Do you start chronologically? Do you write notes? What is it in practicality that you do to start off this thing right here? Has materialised.
You start with a few travel emails to friends, and then you have one called Jano in Sydney, who says, I reckon you'll write a book out of this. And I'll be like, no. But I do love writing. So when I did my first trip, I did write travel emails home and got quite a good response. So I'm like, oh, maybe I'm not boring. That's good. And so seriously, when Jane said to me, I will write a book out of this, I was like, I really won't, because I wasn't a writer at all, apart from, you know, from work. I think everyone's a writer on some level, but like writing a book is a whole other thing. But I did write, like I knew on my first trip, I had like the handwritten, you know, travel diary, like capture my memories, and it was never enough. So I was like, right, it's going to have to be on a laptop. So during Siena, I've written a lot. During Elba, I've written a lot. In Siena, I met an amazing lady called Josephson. I think she's allowed her name out loud, so I can say it right, Josephson. She's an artist down in Sydney. So I met her in Siena, and we were at a dinner as part of the Palio celebrations together. Another Australian who went to Italy regularly, but we were talking over a beer one night, and I was saying that she'd been, I think, an interior designer. I hope I've got that right, because that's what I put in the book, and become an artist. And I was like, oh, I wish I could draw or paint. Like, I'm just not that creative. And she was like, oh, you know, just carry a sketchbook and draw what you see. I'm like, no, I'm really not creative at all. But I said, oh, look, I love writing. And she said, well, write down not just what you see, but what you smell, what you feel, you know, what's going on around you. And I love it. The more I've thought about it, there's a word in Italian, a verb, sentire, which means to hear. So I might like say to Liana, sentire. Listen, talk to you. But it also needs to feel. So if I'm not feeling well, it's really right.
Non sentirmi bene. I don't feel well. I don't feel myself well. Yeah.
Yeah. So it means to hear and to feel. I think it's just such a beautiful, like, that's one of the beautiful things about language learning, is that you, particularly going back to the Latin, you find out where our words come from. But the senses are about feeling and hearing as well. And so when Jo was saying, you know, make sure you're capturing what you're feeling as well as what you're seeing, and it was like, here. So I started to write like that once I got to Elba, which is an island of Tuscany where I worked on the farm, where I had a lot of downtime as well, between hoeing fields and harvesting grapes. But started to write like that a little bit more. And then I got to Naples and I was in the hospital within 24 hours and stuck in hospital without a laptop and also unable to do a lot anyway. And someone brought me a laptop. So I ended up putting notes in my phone because I was so frustrated because there was this like wild Italian life swirling around me. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to capture this. Like, this is like watching a movie that I can't like tell someone about. And so I made notes in my little, it was an Ericsson or a Nokia phone. So I mean, I still had a note section. And I think I ended up with like 2,000 words. So went from the stuff I've written in Siena, then Elba, then transcribing these notes. And then came back, had to recover. It took me a while to like actually hold a laptop, and then managed to get that down and started to write and started to talk to people, realised what a long journey it would be. The book spent many years in bottom drawers and then popped back out. But I always felt like I had a story to tell, and particularly my time in Naples, you know, I experienced so much. And been through, like I did the QWC manuscript development course with Hachette as well a couple of years ago, which helped as well. And this year I had a friend who's been supportive all the time, probably Chris out there. And she basically kicked me in the pants and said, by Christmas, get this book out there. And I was like, oh, so much work. So I've self-published, but I've believed in the story, and I know a lot of my friends have. And also looking around here, I've had a lot of jobs in the past 10 years and I've studied. So I've met a lot of people who all know about this book. And I can see we're going, yeah, we heard about this book. So it's out to everyone having this journey. Go, oh yeah, I'm writing a book. One day it'll happen. So thank you for coming tonight. It means a lot to those on Zoom as well. So
Absolutely. On that note, I think that we will move to some question time. Does anyone have a question for Jackie about the book, even about her time in Italy, anyone's language learning journeys?
I've got a question about the what was the hardest thing about actually writing the book? Was it the writing, or was it the publishing, or was it the what do you think was the hardest bit of this journey for you?
Because she's asking what do you think is the hardest part of this journey of writing the book?
I loved writing it. And in different stages. So when I first came back, I thought, I don't know if this will come to anything. It's very early days, but I've been through something big. I need to write it down. That's my saving on counsellors' version. I think counsellors might be cheap, to be honest, but writing it all down and processing what had happened to me was a big part of it. But as I learned, I was learning to write, and I loved that. You know, obviously, like I said, we all write, and I love doing creative writing. And I meant to say, my English teacher from high school's here. I've thought about many times during this process. But the process of learning to write was amazing. So I enjoyed it, and I think the frustration was more trying to get someone to help me with it. So you're trying to get a publisher to help you, or like I couldn't afford to do, I went back to study and things like that, so it's no way I could afford to pay someone to help me. So it was people like Chris who kicked you in the pants and said, right, get up the hill and start going. TK who's here tonight, who basically said, I need to look at your book and edit it for you. And I love it, TK's like 20 years younger than me, which is awesome. And she also designed the cover. And Alexis, my friend, who gets mentioned in the book several times because she was my flatmate and I travelled with her. But there's people who have just helped me along the way, and I'm so grateful for that. And I get publishers have a market that they need to meet. But I think, sorry to go back to your question, the hardest part was just sticking to it, and particularly once you decide to self-publish, I knew it was going to be the end of my life for the past 6 months, which it has been, and there have been joyful moments, and I'm so glad to be here right now. And so be it. Now I'll promote it. Thank you very much.
Anyone else have a question for Jacqueline?
What happened to the handsome driver?
Jacqueline's been asked, what happened to this handsome driver, moped driver who mowed you down mercilessly on the cobblestone streets of Naples?
Did he come and visit you?
No, he didn't come and visit.
Admittedly, he's probably half my age. It was quite funny. There was like all the swarthy Italian dark. So the North tends to speak like Rihanna, who's from the North. And to be fair, I'm not stereotypical dresses. So it was always sort of men and then this sort of blonde, tan young guy going, to is everything okay? And I'm like lying on the road, going, not really. I look okay. And then thinking, so this was meant to happen for a reason. So
You thought it might have been a mixed cue.
this is bad, but hello, and I remember thinking, oh, no, we're done. So, and then starting to yell again because it's my long name. Sorry, no, nothing.
Oh, tell us about the title, Jacqueline. What inspired the title for the book?
Yeah, interesting. So the title was different. I'm not going to share what the original the next one. It becomes something. And literally, so I was dwelling on this as I entered the self-publishing process, going really need new titles and then continuing to think about self-publishing. So I'm like, right, need a new title. And it actually came to me in the night. Don't know where from. I'm going to say God. Yes. I'm going to say yeah. And I just remember thinking, coming home. And that was part of the writing journey. So want to give away that feel like I'm home. Here I am. Spoiler alert. I guess you go on these journeys and the whole eat, pray, love things. Like I was trying to find myself. I'm like, I don't know that I was actually trying to find myself. I had a sense of who I was, but I felt I also lost something as well along the way, and I was trying to re-find that. So while I was away, there's a lot of exploration of where I come from and my family and the connections and what had shaped me and getting back to that. And so coming home sort of made sense in that metaphorical sense as well as very practically finding myself here tonight.
A
10 years after I came home.
couple of Zoom questions. I'll stand up so that you can hear me online as well.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a question from Helen. Do you feel this is your genre? Will you write another book in this genre or a different one?
Interestingly, no. Maybe. I do feel like there is actually a story to tell about the bit where I came home, particularly I think in the wake of COVID. It's nice to think that I had this magical homecoming, but the homecoming was challenging. It's been amazing though as well. I think a lot of people have had a lot of challenges in the past 2 years in Brisbane and Queensland, relatively lucky, although I don't want to say that across the board because I know different businesses have been affected differently. But people have lost jobs, lost careers, lost different opportunities, and I hope I can speak to that, but that's another book or maybe an article at some point. But yeah, I'm not sure about memoir. I get really tired of talking about myself. I love other people's stories, which I should say is part of that journey. Is I always thought writing about myself has taught me about writing other people's stories because there's so many sensitivities about telling your own story that you're like, well, I don't want to tell people that. And they're like, well, things have been taken out. That's not necessary to the story. But I now, like in my work, I actually do capture other people's stories, which I really love. So I like to tell other people's stories.
A couple of other Zoom questions. One of them is from Pete. Before the accident, what was
Definitely working on Elba. So I so I went and worked on an organic farm with worldwide organic farmers, runners will be woofed. And yeah, it was amazing. And I've actually often thought that coming back, my recovery was recovering from the accident. But I think recovering from Elba, again, last year we had lockdowns where we all slowed down and felt life and re-engaged with family. And for me, Elba was that moment where I slowed down and I didn't have radio. I was living in a caravan, which I can't believe I did. But we didn't have radio or television. I had very little Wi-Fi access. We had rain for 3 days, which meant they turned the power off in the caravan, so I sat in the dark. Or there were floods poured past. But it's such an amazing thing, as many of us know, to slow down and stop. And I think that's actually what I struggled to recover, re-entering crazy corporate life. And I've done some pretty crazy contracts since where I'm like, oh my gosh, why? I want to live life. Despite the highs of some of those contracts.
And a final Zoom question is from Chris. What would you do? Would you do anything different in terms of exploring who we are? That's a bit of a cryptic question. Maybe having finished this book, I wonder whether Chris is suggesting, would you do it differently now that you've finished it? Would you like to go back and re-edit, or how do you feel about what you put on page?
Well, I would say that my best friend John put the book down last week when I was trying to read it. I was really excited. I was like, I'll read my book as a book. And then, of course, all I see is typos. I'm like, oh my gosh. I wish I had, it's tricky. It was such a complex experience I came back from in terms of recovering from the accident. I was still trying to work out what I was doing with my life. I ended up going to uni. So I knew there were passages to learning to write, so I could have joined writers groups or different things like that, which I think would have helped me and probably expedited the process, which I didn't do. But I think if I wrote another book, I'd definitely utilise things like the Queensland Writers Centre a little bit more, which I did, but not as much as there's potential. And yeah, joining writing groups and different ways of helping to get the story out and having that support. Tried to do a bit too much on my own, maybe.
We've got time for one more question from the room. If anyone has a question from the room.
Going back.
Are you going back? That's a good one to end on.
Yeah. Yeah, I miss my Italian friends a lot. It's 10 years since I went back, so I did spend 2 months back there in 2011, which was incredible. Yeah, I've been trying to go back for some time, so I hope we'll get back there. And actually, Leanne and I met through this project, going back to the beginning. So when I went back and studied photography, and one of the projects I did in third year was a project with Brisbane Italians and doing their portraits and trying to emulate Caravaggio with my camera. Work in progress, learning that one. But my hope was also to get back and actually take portraits of some of those who helped me in hospital. Certainly Tina, who lost, but there's many others. So I would love to capture my surgeon, my lawyer, who are all on Facebook. So there's people I'm still in contact with, and I would love to tell their story and tell that story of place. So yeah, maybe one day. Yeah, very much believe that the story of place is very much through the people, from my experience.
It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, Jan, for doing such a great work of the conversation. It's great. Thank you. Thank you, Jacqueline, for bringing this book to us. What a big endeavour, 12 years in the making, and we get to celebrate it tonight. So congratulations, Jacqueline. So we're going to get to the signing table now, and to do that, what we're going to do is only people standing around the door can leave first, and then we're going to get Jacqueline to go through to a signing table before we all stand up, so that she can get out there and be waiting and ready for you. So I think let's do that.
I think